On this super review, let's take a look at the JVC Cross Drop FDX1. So what we've got here is not just a pretty box. We've got an in-ear monitor from the company JVC in collaboration with Drop. So like they tend to do, Drop has collaborated with a manufacturer to take a product that they already make and make it a little bit different. And here we've got the FDX1, which is a variation of JVC's FD01. And that's an in-ear monitor that, if you haven't heard of it, I don't blame you. I hadn't heard of it before. I don't think it's very well known here in the United States, but it did have a little bit of a cult following. The community latched onto this because they liked the way it sounded, but there was some issues, or a lot of people had issues with what seems to be fairly intense treble response. But the community didn't give up on it. So basically the community discovered that if they stuffed some damping material into the nozzle of the FD01, you preserved that sound signature that they liked, but it resolved that issue with the intensity in the treble. And what Drop has done is they've worked with JVC to essentially manufacture that modification. Here with the FDX1, we've got that basically that same earphone design, but it comes with nozzles with different amounts of damping material on it that essentially is gonna let someone like me who's kind of afraid of modding earphones, it's gonna let me get the enjoyment of that modded FD01. Now this is not a cheap earphone. This available on Drop costs around $250. So I've got pretty high expectations for it, and if I'm being perfectly honest, I've heard this earphone before. I've got a friend that had a copy early. I spent some time listening to it. I'm not gonna tell you right now if I like it or not, but let's go ahead and open up. We'll spend some time living with my own copy, and then I'll come back and let you know what I think of the FDX1. All right, so I've spent quite a bit of time listening to this here JVC FD1X, comparing it to some of my favorite earphones. I don't really have anything quite in this price range, but I've been comparing it to my favorites. And I'm ready to let you know what I think about the JVCs. And we'll start like I typically do by talking about the build, the physical aspects of it, the hardware of these bad mamma jammas. I don't normally say bad mamma jammas. That's not the typical part. The typical part is that I start by talking about the build. Anyway, I think really this is a quite nicely built IEM. And we'll start with sort of the less interesting bits is, well, the tips. The tips are actually, I think, kind of like the best tips I've ever had on an in-ear monitor. Now, these tips aren't necessarily gonna work for every other IEM because they are JVC's spiral dots. And what spiral dots tend to do, they're just a wide bore. They let out a lot of treble. If you attach them to an earphone that's already got too much treble, you might not be happy with these tips, but I think they work quite a treat here on the JVCs. It's also worth calling out that these tips are not quite the same as the spiral dots that you might find on Amazon in the US. These things are actually just made of a different material. It's like this super gummy, it's like slow to return to its original position. I don't know, they just exude quality in a way that I don't expect of a tip. So I'm pretty impressed there. The other thing that kind of exudes quality in a way that I didn't exactly expect is this cable here, which is just about, I gotta say, probably the nicest cable I've ever had on an IEM. Now, it doesn't have preformed ear hooks, and that's because this thing is made to be worn either over ear or hanging down. You get the option. And I do kind of wish it had preformed ear hooks, but other than that, look, it's just, oh, it's so nice. Like, it's not like a braided cable. It's not especially flashy. It looks actually fairly understated, but behavior-wise and drape, it's just perfect. I have no complaints except the ear hooks, but that's not even really a complaint, just kind of a mild preference. And then we get into the build of the buds themselves, and I don't know, like everything else, they exude a quality that I guess is befitting the relatively high price of these IEMs. As a reminder, this is a $250 IEM, so not stupid expensive, but more expensive than most of the stuff I've got. So the buds, they're basically just stainless steel front to back. They've actually got a bit of a heft to them. They're a little bit heavy compared to some other IEMs, not quite as heavy as something like the Eco OH10. Those are ridiculously heavy. These things are just a little bit heavy, and mostly that comes across because they don't have the preformed ear hooks. In terms of comfort and fit, that's probably maybe the weakest area of the FD1X, if I'm honest, or FDX1, if I'm honest, and it's not bad. So comfort-wise, well, we'll start with fit. They're not like super molded to fit into your ear like something like a Magaosi K5, right? They're not a super, they're a little bit bulky. And I don't actually have any problems with it, but it just means that fitting them in and out of my ear is a little bit more time consuming than it is with something that fits in a little bit more snugly and effortlessly, if that makes any sense. In terms of comfort, again, they're not the best, but I don't really have any big problems with them. There are like some sharp edges here on the outside of the metal housing that initially I did have some issues with it rubbing against the inner side of, I guess, the concha of my ear. But for some reason, I don't know if it was I just got used to it or if there's a slight difference between this unit and the pre-production unit that I had tried before. I didn't have quite that issue here with my unit. So comfort and fit, pretty decent for me overall. Not the most effortless and the most comfortable, but pretty decent. A couple of, I guess you could say, curiosities about the build that are worth calling out is one, these, the buds, they're made of stainless steel, but they actually rotate 360 degrees, or like the nozzle rotates 360 degrees, and that accommodates what I described earlier is the ability to wear these things over ear or just hanging straight down. Frankly, I'm just gonna wear them over ear, and so I would actually prefer if they didn't rotate, because that rotating mechanism does give them just the slightest amount of free play that I don't think that it feels bad, but when it's in my ear and I'm chewing or I yawn, I can actually feel that free play, or I can hear that free play, and it's not a big issue by any stretch. This is not really a serious complaint. I'm just kind of pointing out that I would prefer if it didn't rotate, but I'm kind of being selfish, because if you want to wear it hanging down, you're going to be happy that it's not stuck in the over ear position. The other curiosity here is that the nozzles are swappable. So it comes with 3 different sets of nozzles, and the swapping mechanism is actually really quite nice. There's like a little pin, little thing that you pull, you rotate, Pushing the next one, it like snaps into position. It's actually, I don't know, I've tried a number of different IEMs that have swappable nozzles or swappable, parts. This is by far the best built swappable parts. Some notes on those nozzles too is that they come in 3 different flavors. There's one with 0 dampening in it. There's a second one with like 50% dampening, and then a third one with 100% dampening. One thing worth calling out is that it seems like the colors that they use to designate those different levels of dampening are different between the production unit that I've got and the pre-production units that a lot of other reviewers got. So if you're wondering like, so-and-so said that they liked the blue filter, well, here with the production unit, that's actually the green filter, at least with my unit. I don't know which colors if they're gonna end up changing those colors back with future production units. So I don't know, I'm gonna describe these things not based on the colors, but based on the amount of dampening in them. And so let's get into talking about the sound and what those nozzles have to do with the sound. This earphone, the JVC FDX1, the original, was kind of known to have a little bit intense treble, and so people used dampening in the nozzles to tame that treble. So the different levels of dampening in the nozzle affect the treble, or at least the idea is that it affects the treble to a 50% amount or 100% amount, depending on how much dampening you put in here. And I can definitely agree that the stock tuning with the nozzles with no dampening is a little bit on the intense side. The treble, it's a little bit intense. And so I did find myself using the nozzle with the most dampening. It did also seem to have a little bit more effect, not just on the treble, but on some of like the upper mid-range tonality as well. Didn't necessarily make it better or worse, but maybe less of a V sound once you've got the dampened nozzles on it, and a little bit more, it's still a little bit bright, but it's a little bit closer to neutral tonality with the nozzles that I've got on here. And that's gonna be, I don't know, all my notes that I'm gonna talk about the sound are gonna be assuming you've got the nozzles with the most dampening, and it would be so much easier if I could say blue nozzles or green nozzles, but you don't know, I don't know. So let's just go ahead and get into talking a little bit more in detail about the sound of the JVCs, which I think, just spoiler, I think these things are probably my best sounding IEMs, and they are the most expensive, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything. But I do think that these things are probably my best sounding. So I don't know, just overall character, I would say that these things are very strong on clarity and very strong on bass impact, but somehow without like an overemphasis in the upper mid-range and without an overemphasis in the bass. They just kind of do everything really, really well. I think you could describe this as a very all-arounder sort of earphone without really any one specific hook. Although maybe there is one specific hook, and for me, it's the bass impact here, all right? So I don't know, if you've been following my channel, watched other reviews, you know that I'm not the biggest fan of a ton of bass. But I gotta say, the bass here is, I think, the best bass of any IEM I've ever heard. Like, not even close, frankly. And it's not so much the amounts of bass, right? It is not a ton of bass emphasis, but it's much more about how you feel the bass. The bass in here, it feels like it's moving air more so than any other IEM that I've got. It's just perfectly well done. And it's definitely more leaning toward the sub-bass frequencies, less so the mid-bass frequencies. And for me, that's perfect, right? Mid-bass frequencies, if they're overemphasized, can give the sound a bit of a warm character to it. Maybe, when it's extreme, a bit of a boxy sound, and you don't get that at all here with the JVCs. You get that sub-bass punch. It feels great, and it doesn't ever make the mid-range, it doesn't ever cloud up the mid-range at all. In fact, if a cloudy mid-range and too much mid-bass can give it sort of a warm sound, I think this is a bit of the opposite. This is almost a bright sounding earphone, and I like that. And now that bass character, I think, allows the mid-range on the JVCs to just be very natural and have lots of room and lots of space without having to resort to shoutiness. I think the tonality on here is basically spot on. There's nice, it's still plenty of room to allow for separation in the different sounds and the mix that happens within the mid-range. I don't think these things stage especially large, but I do think that what these do really well is just the separation in all the different sounds and the positioning of everything. It feels very three-dimensional. in a way that you can't really get if the sound is too boxy and boomy from that mid bass. And then we get to talking about the treble, which could be maybe the most controversial part of the sound of the JVCs. And in fact, that's why the FDX1 exists, is because the treble was a bit of a controversy here, right? With the stock tuning, it's a little bit intense. And even with the most damped nozzles, I would still describe the treble as slightly intense. Now, for my taste, it's not too much at all. In fact, I think that it's very well done. I think it's tastefully done. There is zero issues with sibilance. I think that's great. It just comes across still as like very, very detailed and just on the side of intense, if that makes sense. It could be maybe a little bit fatiguing if you are sensitive to mid treble, but it's not spiky at all. It's just super clear and it's a little bit forward, but again, I don't think that it's a problem. That said, if you're sensitive to this sort of stuff, it's still something to consider. If I personally had any complaints with the treble, it's that I could actually use a little bit more air, right? A little bit more of that treble past 10K. I think that these things do everything south of 10K perfectly. Again, the fact that these things are so detailed and crispy without ever being sibilant is super, super impressive. I do kind of wish there was a little bit more air past 10K, but that's just me being picky. So like I said before, if I'm perfectly honest, these things are clearly my best sounding IEMs, but I'm still gonna go ahead and compare them to some of my other favorites. And we'll start with the Tin Hi-Fi P1, which I think is actually got some things in common with the JVCs, and that is really just in how natural the timbre of everything is. I think that the timbre of the JVCs and the tin is what sets these earphones apart from a lot of other of my favorites, especially compared to a lot of the balanced armature favorites that I've got. It's just everything just sounds so natural and so tonally, I don't want to say perfect, but basically spot on. And that's especially true if you're listening to music with analog instruments, with guitars and drums and stuff like that. If you're listening to electronic music, that difference in the timbre is probably not going to stand out quite as much. But I think that is something that sets both the P1 and these JVCs apart from my other favorites. Now, that doesn't mean that these things sound like the P1s. I think that tonally they're actually fairly different. I think the P1s are head-to-head with these things. They're a warmer sound. They've got a little bit more lower mid-range emphasis, where these kind of come across a little bit brighter sounding. I think that also a big difference between these two earphones is that the JVCs really, really excel in that bass impact. Again, there's just something about the bass on these things that is very, very appealing. But on the other hand, the P1s, the tinned P1s, where they excel is in that extended treble. So I think the P1s, you know, they lack a little bit in that sub bass impact, and these things kill it. But then I think these things lack a little bit in that treble air, and then that's where the P1 excels. So I don't know, they kind of play off each other in terms of different strengths and weaknesses. Overall, I do think this is clearly the better sounding IEM. Like, it just sounds more detailed and fuller and more satisfying all around, but there are still some reasons for me to go back to the P1. And then my other favorite that I wanted to compare versus the JVCs is the Magaosi K5. And how I kind of define the sound of the K5s is, you know, it's strong on clarity and strong on soundstage. But interestingly, head-to-head here with the JVCs, the Magaosis actually almost kind of sound warm and veiled. Like, I don't know, I don't think that this sounds like an especially bright earphone, but when I put the Magaosis up against it, and I think it's probably going to be more down to the mid bass and not quite as lean lower mid range, the Magaosis almost sound warm, which is interesting. I do think that the Magaosi, the K5, has got an advantage in soundstage versus the JVCs, for what it's worth. But I think that when it comes down to the timbre of instruments, again, if we go back to what I said earlier about analog instruments like guitars and drums and stuff like that, I think the timbre definitely comes across a lot more natural here with the JVCs, whereas with the all balanced armatures of the K5s, it can impede a little bit on the quality of the timbre. I think those things sound great with electronic music, But for analog instruments, the JVCs really just kill it. And then again, if we get into talking about the bass impact, the presentation is totally different here with the JVCs. It is just fantastic. Whereas the bass presentation on the K5s, I think is perfectly satisfying. It doesn't have anything on the JVCs. And then one other difference that's worth calling out is in the build and the fit. You know, that's one advantage I'm gonna have to give to the K5s. Those things just fit so easy, so effortlessly, and so comfortably that I can't go without calling out that difference between them. So out of 5 stars, I don't really have an option. I gotta give the JVC FDX1 all 5 stars. I don't know if you've been keeping track. I don't really have any serious complaints about this. I think the build is phenomenal. I mean, okay, I can quibble about the rotating cups, and I can quibble about they don't fit quite as snugly as some of my favorites, but no real serious complaints, and these things really just, they're beautiful. And then we get to talking about the sound, and I have even fewer quibbles. I mean, maybe I would like a little bit more treble air, but that's just me being greedy. Really, the clarity, the amount of clarity on here, and the bass impact. I'm telling you right now, the bass impact on these things is fantastic. And this is coming from someone who doesn't really, like, bass is not what I'm looking for, but when I listen to this IEM, basses, again, it's not like the overwhelming character of the sound, but because of how good the bass is, I'm coming to these things for the bass. They're not cheap, they're $250, but I do think that these things are very clearly my best sounding IEM, and I can totally recommend them. If you're interested in checking out the JVC FDX1, like always, I've got links in the description down below, and while you're down there, you can hit the like button for the video if you liked it. You can subscribe to the channel, and then I'll see you on the next super review.